And if there's no learning disability, they'll tell parents there's no problem. More often there's ADD that they're not testing for. Now the other thing that can make this complicated is there's emotional problems that go with all of these, especially depression and anxiety. For example, for children, about 1 out of 4 that have one of these disorders have depression or anxiety. With adults, 85% of adults with ADD have anxiety or depression with it. And often that gets diagnosed first and the ADD gets missed. So that tends to be really important. Even things like allergies, ear infections, sleep problems, physical things are more common with ADD. What about adults? I have just one slide on adults, but we see a lot of adults. You know who our biggest referral source for adults with ADD is? It's other therapists, psychologists, social workers. They're doing marital therapy. And the one person, let's say it's the husband, keeps doing the same thing. He keeps forgetting to pay the bills, he's impulsive, he's gambling the money, he's forgetting to pick up the kids at daycare, and he's really trying, but the same things keep happening. We see problems in families. Remember what I said, you could have 8 kids and they could all have this? Usually if you have a number of kids with this, one of the parents has it too. So imagine having all these kids with ADD or autism or Asperger's and having one of the parents with ADD, and you have to be organized and consistent and structured and try to remember what consequence you gave to who, and then you have to follow through. It can be very, very difficult. So that's another way we kind of end up working with parents when we try these techniques. The parents mean well, but they just can't do it consistently. And the other spouse usually tells us that the one that they think is ADD isn't doing their job, but they're trying. It affects work. Adults with ADD are very bright, but often they underachieve in work. They're often in sales, and they're really good with people. They're not good with organization. They don't turn their expense reports in. They don't turn their tax reports in. I run an adult ADD support group in the room next door. And I remember a couple years ago, one of the adults who was a contractor told me, this was when the economy was good, he said, you know, I'm really having a hard time in my business. And I said, well, you don't have a lot of work? He says, no, I have a lot of work, but I don't have a good cash flow. And I said, well, what's happening with that? He says, well, probably because I haven't sent in any invoices in 2 years. And I said, yeah. I said, well, I keep meaning to do it, but I get distracted and it's really boring. So, you know, he decided obviously to hire someone to do that, which really helped him, but it's that paperwork. So a lot of people with ADD are very athletic, or they're musical, or they're artistic. I don't see a lot of adults with ADD that are accountants, by the way. I've had 2 in 20 years. So it tends to be the real creative people type of jobs, but you can underachieve in work even though you're very talented. College. A lot of adults with ADD are bright, and ends up people with ADD, when they're treated, are brighter than people that don't have it, but they won't achieve very well in school. They'll go from college to college. I saw an adult today who took 20 years to get his bachelor's degree, and he went to 10 different colleges, and he told me how frustrated his wife was that he kept going to college, because he kept saying, well, I'll finish this chore at home, or finish this once I finish my degree. 20 years. I said, she has a lot of patience. But I mean, that's not unusual. So it really affects how you do in school. It affects your concentration. It affects, was there a question there?
Yeah, I was wondering how you could distinguish between that ADD and just ordinary character defects.
I'm going to get into that with all the testing. That's what we do the testing for. Exactly. Drug and alcohol use. Very common with adults with ADD. 50% of men in the alcohol and treatment center study they did had a history of ADHD. They weren't treated. A lot of young adults we see self-medicate themselves. They use stimulants. They use marijuana to calm down and sleep at night. They use stimulants at work, during the day. So to make this more complicated, like I said earlier, we have things with ADD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, learning disabilities, obsessive compulsive disorder. A couple times a year, we have adults that come in that have schizophrenia, that have been told they have ADD by someone like real quick, like an HMO, family physician. They're given Ritalin and they come in and they say, this medicine's making me feel crazy, and we test them and they actually have something like schizophrenia. I'll show you, I think I have a picture of, I might have a picture of one of these, but it's totally, totally different brain map than someone with ADD. Let me get more detailed about what AD is. There's 3 core characteristics. The first one is inattention. You have a hard time with sustained attention or persistence of effort. So this could be listening to the teacher in class, listening in a conversation if you're an adult, remaining focused at work, remaining focused at school. You're unorganized. You're very easily distracted. You have trouble with follow-through, and you lose things and you're forgetful. So what would a child have trouble with follow-through and losing things? What would that affect for them very commonly? Homework, right. You know, they always say, well, I did the homework and I forgot to turn it in. And a lot of these kids do, and it's frustrating not just for the teachers, but for the students when they do it and they don't turn it in. What about adults with ADD? What might they forget?
Pay their bills.
But what might they forget to take with them? Keys. Wallets, cell phones. In the other support group I run at Saddleback Church, we did a poll when I first started running that group about 13 years ago. And I asked, there was about 10 people there, said, how many of you have lost your keys in the last week? Guess how many out of 10? 10 out of 10. 2 people had lost their keys that day. 1 person had locked their keys in the car right before the group. It's just part of ADD that you get distracted and forget things. Impulsivity, impulse control is the second characteristic. You know, we think of impulsive of somebody getting in a fight, but this can be verbal, can be blurting out in a conversation, interrupting somebody. You have a hard time waiting your turn. You have a hard time waiting in line. You know when a lot of these social problems happen in school is when the kids have to line up and leave the class or come in and they're kind of bored and they want to get up front and they get impatient. You interrupt or intrude on others. Running out in the street without looking both ways, that's a common example. But remember, it can be verbal. So the girls will often have verbal impulsivity and not have it physically, and it gets missed. Now the hyperactivity, this is the part most people think of. You're kind of squirmy, you're fidgeting your feet, you have a hard time sitting still. The adults tell me they can't sit through movies at the theaters without getting up a couple of times because they kind of feel antsy inside. They can't turn their brain off at night. So they have a hard time sleeping a lot of times. They have a hard time calming down. And a lot of parents of the younger kids describe them like the ever-ready bunny. It keeps going and going and going because they do. They wear everyone out. But you can have inattention without the hyperactivity and impulsivity, and you can have it verbal. One of my favorite explanations of ADD, especially if it's not hyperactive, is I like to call it interest deficit disorder. Because a lot of people, especially when students get to middle school and high school, they can do really well. And if they really like a teacher or if they really like a subject. But if it's a boring subject, and I tend to hear about social studies a lot and math, or if they find a teacher boring, they'll have a very difficult time. Same student, same day. They really like science or they like the English teacher, they could function much, much better, focus much, much better. So this is why some parents come in and say, well, how can my child have ADD? Because they can play video games for hours. Well, video games are made to be overstimulating, almost to kind of get you addicted. But my analogy is doing homework for a child like with ADD is like one of you doing your taxes every night, having to do your taxes every night. Not fun, huh? Let's talk about autism. Autism, I think, is on the other extreme. There's 3 core characteristics of autism we look for. The first is impairments in social interaction. This can be something subtle, such as not, really having a good idea how to make friends, but it can be significant enough where they might not even acknowledge a child who's sitting right next to them playing with the same toys. They have impairments in communication. This can be very subtle in terms of how they talk and repeat and kind of parrot things, to having severe speech problems and being with kids that are severely autistic being almost nonverbal. And then they have these restricted or stereotype behaviors. Some of the behaviors are kind of unique to autism. You don't see with other things like flapping your arms, rocking back and forth, walking on your toes. Some of these behaviors are kind of unique, but not all kids have those real classic behaviors. Autism is usually diagnosed the youngest of all these areas, typically before 3, and that's because of the speech concerns. Nowadays, the pediatricians are trying to screen this at 18 months, and the regional centers, which we were talking about earlier, are available to help do screening for kids that, the